Thank you. Okay, want to launch the...
Yeah, all right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jonas Brunsvik. I am the project leader for academic relations here at Swissnex. This event has actually been a long time in the making. Charles had approached my predecessor a few years ago with the idea for this event, and we're actually thrilled that it's happening finally. Bear with us. As you can see, the technology is not flawless, so AI might not yet be taking over. We're very grateful to Charles for inviting all of you and the wonderful speakers in Geneva. We're also grateful to the Center for Curriculum Redesign, the Montes Alti Foundation, the Fondation Helvetica Educatio, and to the University of Geneva for hosting the other part of this event. Without further ado, I will give the word to Charles to kick us off.
Well, thank you so much, Jonas. And would you mind launching the PDF?
Yeah.
So, hello everyone. I'm delighted you're all here in person, for all of you here in the room, as well as those in Geneva. And all of you online around the world. I know we have attendees in Alberta, Singapore, and other places. So welcome all. And for those of you who are interested in tweeting the event, the hashtag is 4DEDU. So with that, next please. Again, as Jonas was mentioning, I'm very grateful to Swissnex. It was putting this event together was complicated across an ocean. And as he said, let's keep in mind, as we fear AI taking over the world, that in the end, AI will be relying on operating systems that are human-made, and therefore they'll be crashy and buggy. And so we'll see how that goes. And I want to thank, of course, the panelists. So we have Pierre Dillambourg, a professor at École Polytechnique in Lausanne. We have Conrad Hughes, a principal at the International School of Geneva. And we have Stéphane Marchand, professor at UNIG. All of them are on the Geneva side of this conversation. Then here we have Frank Levy, professor at MIT, Rick Miller, president of Olin College, Robert Plotkin, patent attorney and author of The Genie in the Machine, and then Todd Rose, director of the Mind, Brain, and Education program at Harvard. Fascinating people. We're going to have a wonderful conversation. So at first, delays notwithstanding, we're going to set the stage for the conversation and divide the conversation in two facets. One, which is really first the impact of AI and robotics on occupations and tasks. And then, once we define exactly what that might be, these are questions arising from that, we want to talk about the impact on education. As you will see, we will have 2 10-minute breaks. And this is intended to be an open conversation that will try to unearth questions more than answers. We all, of course, all understand this is a long haul. The questions are only starting to accumulate. And people like Frank and others have been working on these issues for a long time. And so we are trying to come up with something, a balanced view of what's actually happening, not a hype-ish view and not a dismissive view either. Next. So the question, of course, that everyone is asking is this time different. For those of us who've been around the block, we've heard a lot of these questions since the 80s, which at the time were referring questions some from the 60s and before. So is this time different? Golden Katz, professors of economics here at Harvard, have talked about the race between technology and education. And this is a diagram showing what this implies. When technology zooms ahead, as it did during the Industrial Revolution, we find ourselves in situations of social pain. And when education catches up, as it did from the 1900s onward, we saw a period of prosperity. And so the question in everyone's mind now is, are we seeing a repeat of that situation with social pain arising from the fact that due to the digital revolution, we have, again, this hysteresis that has opened up between technology and education? Frank Levy here has been one of the authors of this long-standing research showing how occupations have changed. This is data from the United States, showing that non-routine occupations, be they analytical or interpersonal, have risen. And I'm talking, of course, about consulting and engineering and other professions of that kind. Whereas professions that are routine, be they cognitive or manual, rose and then dropped from the 80s onward. And we're talking here about professions such as traditional office workers and routine manual labor. Now note the last line, it's about non-routine manual work. And that means plumbing, truck driving, things that are not easily offshoreable or automatable. But we also know that some of these professions, such as driving, for instance, are under pressure once automatic vehicles show up in force. Next. The press, of course, has been enjoying the conversation and fueling the debate. The question in everyone's mind here is whether it's alarmist or realistic, whether there's something developing, again, this time being different. The other view of this is that, unfortunately, we don't react unless we have some form of pressure. And for those who have shrugged away the year 2000 bug, let's keep in mind that we avoided it because the whole planet worked on avoiding it. And so it was a non-event by design. It would not have been a non-event without that, possibly. Next. And very often we see this sort of pattern emerge, right? A hype cycle, as Gartner calls it, where we see an enormous amount of press on a given topic, and then that crashes after a year or two, and then the real work continues, and eventually things pop out. We've seen this in technology after technology, and we've seen this even in AI and robotics, over the past 20, 30 years. So to what extent are we seeing a situation that is, again, this time different? Next. And as you know all from how we have dealt with technology, we tend to think about it in a very linear way. And so at first, because a lot of these systems are S-curves and nonlinear, we underestimate what happens at first, and we tend to poo-poo it when we don't see the immediate results. So we go through the hype, then we poo-poo and not pay attention to what goes on. And then over the long run, it starts overtaking our wildest expectations. So I'll remind you of the internet or personal digital assistants that have become smartphones, what they were about at first and what they have become, completely blowing away our expectations. And sometimes you wonder who exactly to call and ask, because whether it's experts or non-experts, we're seeing that the predictions that were made by experts or non-experts are not particularly different. And so, should we even bother? And yet we have experts here at Oxford who have tried to put some semblance of analysis into it. And there are, of course, a lot of flaws in the way that analysis was conducted. But let's also mention at their defense that there are two conditionals in their study that are missed by the press typically, which is the word potentially, and then the word automatable. So two conditionals to hedge, which of course would go unnoticed, and the press would report this as 50% of US jobs will be disappearing by 2020 or whatever. So the shortcut doesn't do us any favor. Next. So we've seen acceleration. If you look at games and how they have progressed over time, the relative complexity of the games that machines are winning at has increased. It seems to be increasing faster. Go was predicted to be cracked perhaps in a decade, and it surprised even Google that DeepMind won at Go during the past month. Go has 10 to the 170 different permutations, and so that was significantly more complicated than chess. And yet we got there 5 to 10 years early. But let's keep in mind one thing. When we are awed by these things, as awesome as they are, let's keep in mind that these are bounded/structured problems. They look impressive, and it is impressive, of course, for AI to be winning at these games, whether it's Jeopardy or otherwise. But these are still bounded and structured problems. They have a finite data set, a finite set of possibilities. And what we're going to be discussing today is what are the tasks and what are the complexities that humans have to face, and to what extent some of these elements are bounded or not. But also let's keep in mind that we've always had this argumentation going on. Humans will never be beaten at chess. Humans will never be beaten at Jeopardy, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually they get beaten. Humans are the only ones who can improvise. The humans are the only ones who can do this or that. And we're finding this receding horizon further and further. And so that's the part of the conversation. So there are areas where machines can easily best humans. When it is about a huge amount of data with thousands of inputs and creating a unified model at scale, with of course remembering that a lot of that algorithmic analysis comes from humans, and that humans inject their own cognitive biases in the analysis. But at least these are areas where machines have been doing extremely well in recent times. Whereas as humans, we have to access a lot more data. And so building holistic pictures and seeing connections between different sets of data that the machines may not have at any given time. And so we also have to figure out the source of the data. In this case of Jeopardy, it ingested Wikipedia by and large, and so someone had to decide what set of data was to be ingestible by IBM's machine. And very often we find ourselves limited by our imagination. In this diagram, this drawing done by Jean-Marc Coté in 1899, he was asked to predict a number of technologies, and this is how he saw robotics. There was a maid pulling a contraption, because, of course, everyone had to have a maid to clean the floors, and everyone had to have a broom. So with the technology and the mindset of the days, that's what was imagined. No one at the time could have imagined Roomba. Completely different form factor and really, really good at one task. And so the question will be here today, will we be seeing a death by 1,000 cuts, meaning lots of things like Roomba, each one being really good at just one thing. We don't have to wait for generalized artificial intelligence for impact to be seen. It could be just single tasks done extremely well by AIs. In this case, you see this cartoon from Dilbert dated 2011 about his Siri or equivalent scheduling a meeting and freaking out his assistant. Well, 5 years later, we have that. So it was a cartoon, a joke, and it's a reality 5 years later. Again, now, Amy, in this case, the AI, is only capable of scheduling meetings. But that's done sufficiently well to replace that human task. And even when you look at composition, if you think of services like Spotify or Pandora, what have they done? They have analyzed 40-odd parameters of music. And this is how they can serve you music that resembles a composer that you like. Well, this has been taken a step further over the past 20 years at the University of Santa Cruz. And there are demonstrations now of AI mimicking the style of Bach and Beethoven and Mahler and Scott Joplin and so on, which is something a good piano teacher can do. But it also shows that elements of incremental innovation are now automatable. Not necessarily radical yet, but certainly elements of incremental innovation. And so I'm going to let both sides read of this and not add to the cognitive load. So as you can see, the conversation now is going in a healthier direction of how do humans and machines work hand in hand. It's a bit, it's about time, I would say, that we get into that sort of mindset. This has happened with technology since the dawn of humanity. And it reminds me of the age-old debate in anthropology. Does the tool precede intelligence, or is intelligence preceding the tool? Well, the two are in a feedback loop. And this is an example of the feedback loop and how it will be accelerating. And so it will be up to us to figure out how we can accelerate ourselves to benefit from this loop. Which also implies a broader view of what education is about, right? It's not about only facts that can be searchable or even procedures that can be searchable. It's a broader understanding of knowledge and what it's about, and the skills on how we use that knowledge and how we behave and engage in the world, and how essentially, importantly, we reflect and adapt. That adaptation, that meta-learning ability is essential in a world that's constantly evolving at a faster pace. And so one of the concerns one might have is, are we reaching an event horizon? Are things accelerating to the point where formal education systems cannot catch up? And that is certainly one of the things we are concerned about. But then we can look at the positive aspect of AI and think, well, could we use AI to catch up? Why not use what's actually creating the tension? And so for today, we're going to be asking ourselves questions and trying to unearth as many questions as possible. And then we will take the next couple of months, a couple of years to try to answer as many of them as possible. So this is a conversation. I'm not asking for predictions. And we are assuming here no generalized artificial intelligence. So let's not go into the complete unknown here. And let's talk about how can machine learning foster and shoulder human learning. Okay. And so to kick this off, I'm going to ask us to focus on next one. I'm sorry. We're going to focus first on an example from the legal profession. Both Frank Levy and Robert Plotkin have done work in this area. And we're going to ground the conversation by starting to talk about what exactly is that practice about and how much of it is automatable or not. And here I've listed the conclusions out of one of Frank's papers, showing that at least in the case of law, and in my opinion, that's something that's generalizable, which we can discuss. Typically, the analysis we see published fail to fully grasp the magnitude of the difficulty, the technical details. And they fail to grasp the difficulty of the human tasks and exactly what is going on in a given task, and particularly the breadth of what a profession is about. So before we make statements saying that, lawyers or nurses or whatever occupation is fully automatable, let's understand all of these vagaries and start the discussion there. So Frank, I'd like to turn it to you at this point and ask you to describe a bit your research here. And then I'll ask Robert to answer, and then we'll open it up to Geneva to answer and think it through as well with us.
Sure. Let me talk for 1 second about the origin of the paper. We, for the last 3 years up and through last June, we had been running a joint discussion group of computer scientists and economists at MIT. And one of the general senses that we economists got, we were getting a lot of the educational benefit out of it, was that the computer scientists were saying we can do wonderful things, but a lot of the popular literature is just way overblown. So that in order for me to get a better understanding and to have a vehicle for learning more, it seemed like the right way to approach it was to take one occupation and look at it in detail. And there had been a lot of discussion about lawyers' work being entirely automatable quite soon. And so I chose that, and through friends got connected with a lawyer who had actually, Dana Remus, who had actually done some work on the subject. I think that the approach was to first, rather than look at a specific task that could be automated to first look at what lawyers did and break it down task by task, and then look at available software and talk to software developers and do some projection and so on and so forth. And I'd say that what we came out of it with was a sense that there were certain tasks that in fact had been quite far along in being able to be automated because they were quite structured. I think the most discussed example is the job that lawyers have in the discovery process of a trial, where they have a set of documents and they have to sort through them to see which ones of them are responsive to questions raised by the court, and then have to be turned over to the other side, the opponents in the trial. And so that really is a case where machine learning can do quite well. You have a training sample and a set of lawyers figure out which of these are responsive, which aren't, and then you can develop algorithms to learn the pattern and then use those algorithms to run through the rest of the documents, of which there can be enormous volumes, just separating into what's responsive and what's not responsive. On the other hand, there are a lot of other, even in terms of document search, there are a lot of other situations where machine learning really doesn't do very much. For example, if you're in the process of acquiring a company and you want to see whether the company has any contractual relations with people who might be in violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, you're just not going to be able to get the kind of training data to train an algorithm to know what to look for in that kind of a situation. And it's this basic question about unanticipated contingencies. Are you in a particular task, are you likely to come up with things that really wouldn't typically show up in a set of training data? And so it really is left to humans to do. So that was really the kind of work that we did in that paper.
Thank you, Frank. And so, Robert, perhaps you can bring in your view, and since you've done a lot of analysis yourself on how to automate your own work.
Yeah, I'll just say a few words about a few different directions that I come at this from. First of all, I've been a lawyer for 20 years now. I've worked at some large law firms for a few years, and I've run my own small firm for 16 years now. I also have a background in computer science, software development, and as Charles mentioned, I wrote a book on automation of invention. So I've studied history of innovation and automation. So this is something I think about a lot and practice every day. I've done a lot of automating in my law practice, but what I found is that, as Charles mentioned, we don't need to wait for there to be a general artificial intelligence. In fact, in law practice, and I suspect in other fields and professions, there's a lot of what I'd call low-hanging fruit for increasing efficiency just by systematizing how things are done, even if that systematizing is done manually without any kind of automation. Many of you may have read Atul Gawande's book, The Checklist Manifesto, where he encouraged doctors to just use checklists on paper and found that it radically reduced errors. In that case, could be life-saving reductions in errors just by the simple use of checklists. So we shouldn't overlook these kinds of low-tech ways of systematizing or routinizing that don't require any technology, much less a generalized AI. And what I found in my own practice is that to systematize things does require people within the organization to develop some kind of a mindset that enables them to learn how to systematize work that they're doing. And it doesn't come easily to people, I think, who don't come from an engineering background where that's what you're taught. It may be as simple as asking someone, well, when you write a document, can you keep track of the steps you take to write it? And when you write that same document 20 different times, can you keep track of it each time? And then let's come back and take a look at your notes and see if we can systematize that process and look for things that can be made into a checklist. And part of the complexity there is people sometimes I found get stuck, and I think this does relate to education, but we can talk about how to teach people to do this. People will sometimes get stuck and say, well, there's 10 steps, but one or two of these steps, I know I could never explain fully how to do it because it requires some intuition or expertise or judgment or discretion. And but I found in many cases, it's still possible to systematize then the 80% of it that can be systematized, and in the checklist itself, leave a step which says to the person who's performing it, for this step, go to a senior person who can now use their human intuition that can't be systematized. And so I've heard this called systematizing the routine, and leave the exceptions or the exceptional cases still to human discretion. And I find that very interesting in day-to-day work, to figure out how to make the most use of systems, routine systems, for the parts that can be systematized, while making it clear when expert humans need to be brought into the mix, and doing that in a way that makes sure that, in fact, the human expertise is brought in when it needs to be, so that people don't attempt to perform some step requiring human expertise just using a checklist when it won't work. So there's definitely some complexity in learning how to do the systematizing, how to teach people to cooperate and collaborate with each other on systematizing things. Probably the biggest thing, I'll just repeat and I'll end, there's a lot that can be done to improve how processes work without using any technology at all. And the very last thing that is, even if you're going to use technology and automate, you still need to, as the first step, go through that process of systematizing and documenting how the process would work in a very rigorous way, just so that you can automate it. And so that systematizing step is critical, both to enable the process to work more efficiently without technology, but also then to enable you to start moving towards steps of automating if you do choose to go to that next step.
Thank you, Robert. Let's hear from Geneva, reactions to what has been said by Frank and Robert. First, can you still hear us?
Yes, here.
Wonderful.
Try to put back the camera. Little moment.
Okay.
Are you with?
Yes. Fine. Who would like to comment or ask questions?
Maybe one comment is about gamification. Not gamification, gamifying. If we can automate something, you can reverse the automata. And so if lawyers start with AI tools that compute part of the routine task, the bad guys can reverse probably this algorithm. And we have the same case with automatic graders. You know, in MOOCs, some of the people develop automatic graders. So if you receive 3,000 essays to grade, they can automatically produce a grade for you, and which is kind of scary. The problem was that it works. It predicts pretty well the grade given by the teacher. Of course, if the teacher has to grade 3,000 essays, he's not a teacher anymore. He's not a human anymore. He becomes himself a robot. But the question is, if you can do it, you can automatically grade, it probably means that you can also probably generate with some clear patterns that were a feature of the machine learning algorithm. You could probably generate also some of the text. And at some point, there is always someone who will find a way to, and by understanding the way that the automata is working, to game it and to for instance, pass the essay without knowing anything about it.
All right. So Pierre, thank you. Let me ask. Can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you. Did you hear what was just said?
Yeah, we did, Pierre. Thank you. And I just wanted to ask whether you felt what's your reaction to the complexity of automating tasks? You know, the complexity of going through and figuring out what exactly can be systematized. Because as Robert was saying, it's relatively easy once you go through the process, but very often it's hard to go through the process itself to figure out what to make of it. So you ask humans code.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes. what do you make of Robert's comment about the difficulty of extracting from humans what they feel can be automated? Well, how difficult it is to ask them to be systematic in their thinking to figure out what can be extracted?
I would say to this that, in fact, this goes not by explicitly asking humans to automate their process or to discover what is systematic in their process, but rather proposing them tools for support. And I wish to, in this conversation, to emphasize the idea of supporting artificial intelligence rather than replacement. So that by proposing tools in some function, in some job, you will actually get acceptance of these tools where probably the routine can be automated, and more difficulty in acceptance where the part of the task cannot be so much automated. So in fact, you can actually discover the automation, the systematization of the task by proposing tools replacing or supporting some part of the task, and look at the acceptance of these tools within the task. And where the tool is accepted, the task can be systematized. That's what I would say.
Thank you. So you're saying rather than having a human try to figure out what to exactly systematize, have the tool figure it out in concert with the human. Anyone would like to comment on this?
I think, it's certainly, that's one approach. One thing I've done, again, in my manual way, is to have 3 people involved sometimes. Maybe one person is doing what they're suggesting the machine could do, which is, I've actually done this in my law firm, where if I want to systematize something that my paralegal is doing, submitting a document to the patent office in my case, I'll have her try to explain that to another person who has no legal knowledge or skill. Here's someone who knows nothing about what you're doing. Explain to him or her how to do this. And the third person, sometimes it's me, and sometimes I've had a consultant do it, is a person who's good at process type thinking to help ease that explanation. Step in and ask follow-up questions as my paralegal is explaining to this new person to try to tease out the systematic aspects of what she's saying, because as an expert, when she explains this process to a novice, she often will explain it in expert type ways, which are not that useful for making a routine process. So to have the process expert involved can help translate what the expert is saying into something that the novice can understand. I suppose you could have a piece of software playing that role, and you could have the novice be a computer also. It's just another way of translating expert human knowledge into something that can be programmed. So that's a contribution.
Anyone in Geneva would like to add something? Conrad, for example, you were one of the best read person I've ever met, and I'm very curious as to your reactions to all of this.
Well, I no comment on being the best read person you've met, Charles. I think what we're talking about here is also frameworks, systems, and policies that institutions and organizations need to develop, so that there's a systematic approach to decision-making, that you have a workflow in place that is sustainable and doesn't depend on the whims of individuals. And that is a fundamentally human process, an evaluative process, where I think you need to sit together and decide who is accountable for a task, who is responsible, who needs to be informed, and where there should be consultation. I think that if you find yourself in a crisis situation, if you're in a good institution, you will have a policy document that will lay out in a fairly systematic fashion what you should do, and you should follow those steps rather than make judgment calls left, right, and center. So in a sense, there's something quite sort of automatic, machine-like in that process. But that's really what I'm getting from this. It's the importance of that rigor and that systematic approach to difficult situations coming from a framework and policy documents that have been developed. So in a sense, that has very little to do with machines. In a broader way, I suppose it does.
Thank you, Conrad. And so Frank, from your experience in looking at various occupations, to what extent do occupations know what they actually do?
I haven't looked at enough occupations to give you a general sense of that. Once you learn one occupation well, that takes a lot of time. And so talk to me in 5 or 10 years.
All right. Is it, do you feel that there may be a bias of sorts, an expert bias, where it's hard to extract one's own expertise after a while? And this is a question valid for anyone here.
Well, I think that part of the problem, I mean, one of the processes that you've been talking about, which comes up in this, is suppose a machine performs a task in a slightly different, less perfect way than a human might do it. Initially, that may not be accepted, or at least the practitioner may certainly say, well, that wouldn't be acceptable. But in fact, there may be a big market for that out there. And in fact, that may be the way that you begin to see a lot of artificial intelligence advancing. That the issue comes up in the legal stuff with what's called proportionality. Maybe some sort of automated contracting mechanism, some blockchain contract is not as perfect a contract as a lawyer might write, but for a lot of low stakes transactions, that might be just fine. A practitioner may not be able to see that because they're too wedded to doing it the way they're doing it.
Oh, thank you. That's an important point. I mean, we've all downloaded forms of the internet with that requires zero AI, and we've used these forms, and that has replaced some legal time.
Right.
Thank you. Stefan, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think you were just saying that we all downloaded some forms from the internet, but in fact the legal legal context of what we are talking about is very restrictive, because we all downloaded automatically translated notices, procedure to, for example, to mount a furniture or IKEA furniture. And actually, it may not be so perfect, but it's fine for explaining what it should do. Of course, the legal aspect of a document adds the need for some perfection. So that creates an extra problem. But for a lot of tasks, maybe some of the imperfection can be acceptable because they don't have an impact on the actual foundation of the task. But the legal aspect of that, as could be, for example, for medical purposes, you need some kind of perfection. But for just some daily tasks or exchanges, you may not need that perfection that is asked by legal or medical purposes. That would be my comment. And so intelligence in these domains, these very specific legal or medical, and maybe some others, for security, for example, in terms of, for example, driving a car, cannot be so much approximated. So they need to reach some kind of a level before being accepted. But maybe it could be far more incremental in many other domains. I don't know.
Can I jump on that, Charles?
Please, by all means.
I want to disagree with Stefan. I mean, the discussion so far has been, are there some tasks for human beings that are routine enough to be replaced efficiently by computers? But what about the tasks that it's not simply that they can be replaced, but they should be replaced by computers because humans are not so good. Humans are not so good in driving. 1 million people die per year. And talking about lawyers, what are the most frequent mistakes that lawyers do? And maybe we should focus on what they do badly and not on what they can do routinely. I remember a big crime story that lasts for 5 years in my original country, where the killers used to kill people, collect the empty bullets, I don't know how you call it, and bring them to the place of the next killing, and mixing completely the inquiry so that within 20 years we never found what was the story? There were more than 40 people killed like that. And they just will reach the limit of human intelligence to solve this very complex murder game. So that's an interesting case. It's not because lawyers or inquiry people could be replaced, but because they fail. And that's where I would put more. With all the medical doctors are not good. Some of them, there is a tumor, but they don't see it. Some of
Sorry, there's been a disruption. Are you with us?
Yes, we heard you as you were just about to say. You just said teachers too are of very variable quality.
And some crazy teachers.
fantastic. Some are in jail.
So, well, thank you. So, well, Rick, on that front, since you've done amazing work at Olin, could you please share your thoughts?
Well, there's no doubt that automation and computing plays an important role in how people learn and what they need to learn, particularly having experience in an engineering school, teaching people about technology sort of front row and center in what we do. But frankly, I've been more impressed looking forward with the role of the things that are not technical in teaching and not technical in learning, things like attitudes, behaviors, and motivations. It's this intrinsic motivation, this making sense of the world, this passion about learning and about making a difference, which seems to have a longer impact than the knowledge that people have. There's been some work by this fellow, James Heckman at Chicago, in looking at whether this basic assumption that we've had, I think, for hundreds of years, the more you know, the better your life will be. That's why we send our kids to school. I'm not suggesting that there's not truth in that. But if you actually do the math, it's not obvious that it's a linear correlation there or that it continues for a long period of time. I think it's true that Heckman's work identified what he calls grit as being a much better predictor of long-term positive outcomes in life than knowledge or intelligence, which in the education setting raises the question, what is grit? And can you teach it? I happen to believe personally that every time a teacher goes into a classroom, they are teaching more than the content of the subject. They're also teaching attitudes, behaviors, and motivations, most of which they're not aware of. But for example, a teacher who is very hopeful has a better chance of spreading hope and optimism among the students than one who is very cynical. And you may not even be aware of what your attitudes and behaviors are. Certainly in today's environment, it's not something that we talk about much or we focus much about.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. And Todd?
Yeah, I think most of my thinking will probably be in the second session.
Yeah.
So, but I think this is building on what you just said about the sort of just knowledge-based component. And I think a lot of the literature around how you can help things like grit develop, and that the kid needs to end up having a pretty positive experience in the moment, right? So the process of learning, you need to have some struggle, but it's got to be manageable.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of this comes back to how we create really good feedback mechanisms, which in traditional, without technology, you can't do it on the time scale in the way that you need it to really, from a neuroscience standpoint, to really have that kind of positive effect. And so I'm interested in how the technology can actually help us provide better feedback loops in that process.
And that will be definitely what we're going to be discussing for the next 2 hours. I would like to perhaps synthesize to a certain extent, perhaps that's still a valid human task, the conversation so far. The whole aspect of occupations that aren't necessarily clear on what they do in a systematic way. One way of unearthing that is the manual aspect or the human dimension of trying to figure it out oneself. The other aspect is have the machines help us figuring it out by tracking basically the behaviors and the mechanisms. The next concept that emerged, of course, is the issue of it doesn't have to be perfect. It has to be good enough. And there's, of course, a thresholding function. Past a certain threshold, it's good enough. So we didn't have to have perfect speech recognition or perfect translation accuracy for it to be good enough for a lot of tasks. And that's something to keep in mind. And oh, by the way, recall how speech recognition had a 65% accuracy, and now it's at 95%, right? So it was good enough to be sellable and improved over the couple of decades to the point where now it's equivalent to human detection levels. And lastly, the comment on focusing on what humans do poorly, not just on what humans do well. Perhaps this is where there would be far less societal resistance and a lot more gains, of course. So on one side, in essence, it's the two ends of the distribution. The boring, tedious, sweeping the floor thanks to Roomba aspect, and on the other side, the incredibly complicated task that only a few humans could master, examples of high-end games or whatever, but of course generalizable to all sorts of other occupations, and from which we derive a lot of benefit, and everything else in between, of course. So with that, I think we should take a 10-minute break, and we'll be back promptly after that. Thank you, everyone. And stay with us, Geneva. See you in 10 minutes. Vous nous entendez à Genève?
Oui.
Okay, super. So let's kick off the second part of this conversation now. Push the conversation into the domain of education, how education can benefit from artificial intelligence, and how to pair that with human intelligence. But first, I'm going to start with a somewhat provocative question to Todd related to neuroscience of education. So here we have machines improving. Is there a let's say, technological case or an ethical case related to forcing humans to improve via, via first neuroscience techniques, which DARPA is researching, or even to go more bluntly into gene editing? Do we want to keep up with the machines that way?
So for me, it's more of like a philosophical, ethical question, which I would say no. We're also encountering this with smart drugs, right? Like that ultimately, as we get better at making you better at learning and memory, the question becomes, can you start to force, first of all, who gets that? And then if you want to be equitable about it, can you just make kids take these drugs because you can accelerate their ability to learn and it saves time and money? But I think that, I think from a standpoint of not screwing up our entire society, that actually I don't think taking early kinds of insights about things and forcing them on everyone is a very good idea.
So without the forcing, but you think that society will, how can I say, feel compelled to keep up? In other words, if we have the steering approach, you have the, let's say, the neurotechniques that you see in the press and advertise that, improve your brain by doing these calisthenics, etc. Then you have the drug aspect. Why wouldn't everyone be taking Adderall or Ritalin to keep up? And then, of course, the more ethically difficult even aspect of gene editing.
Yeah. I think that there's a value proposition to a lot of it that may become overwhelming, and people may opt into a lot of it. But I'm a big believer in there's no free lunch, and that all of these things have trade-offs. And so, like, even when we think about education and some of these things, from neuroscience techniques to drugs to gene editing, that we often think about the efficiency of the system as being like, hey, we can get kids through school quicker, they can learn more things, but then you forget, like, actually a lot of what you want to be in school for isn't just was the things we already talked about. It's not just this rapid acquisition of facts and memory formation, and that, in fact, we may not want kids. I mean, maybe it's more of a slow learning movement. That we don't actually want that as a goal.
Excellent. So, Conrad, you might have views on this. Do you still have the link? Conrad, can you hear us?
It cut off a bit there.
Okay, you're back on. Do you have views on this?
Yes. the whole debate that we've had up until now seems to have been premised on cognitive, individual approach to education and to intelligence. And we have to think about the psychomotor domain, about the affective domain. And we also have to move away from individuals to society, learning to live together, sustainability. These are the real problems that are threatening us. So, individuals catching up with machines or being able to perform better than machines is not going to create a better world, I don't think, necessarily. And increasingly, a 21st century education needs to focus on learning to live together with less. Things like intercultural competence. I know that you're doing a lot of work on character. If you take the Delors report, the 1996 Delors report, The Treasure Within, those 4 pillars, learning to know, learning to learn, learning to be, and learning to live together, those are critical. And the one that's the most challenging is learning to live together. So I think it takes us quite far from artificial intelligence. And that's a whole other perspective that we could be taking. Very far from neuroscience, from algorithms, from automating processes, from the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy and how machines can do that instead of human beings. It's the social capital that we need to nurture. And I don't think that machines are really going to help us all that much to do that. That's what I think intuitively.
Thank you. So to Stéphane and Pierre, what if machines were able to help us with that in the sense that they can help us analyze all sorts of societal issues on a broader scale, or potentially?
Who was the question for, Charles?
Well, all 3 of you, but I was directing it to the technologists in this case, thinking, well, sure, we do have enormous problems, but what if we were helped in solving these problems by simply having data mining on a scale we cannot digest? That is a good outcome.
Yeah, just before they come in, clearly machines will help us with the analytics, but it's the, I think what you do with that information, obviously, that requires not just a human response, but a communal response, a societal response.
Right.
But you present us as technology. I'm a school teacher. I'm an education guy. I used to be a school teacher, and down the road, whatever we talk about is in the meat. So somewhere it will be in the neurons. And see if you learn, if you manage to cope with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family. We cannot escape from the fact that down the road this is going to be in the neurons and in the neuroscience. Despite this, I'm very worried about the development of neuroscience in education for many reasons, but one of them is what we've seen here that happened in the States, I think 10 years ago, is the medicalization of education. Parents are anxious about their kids, and they are happy when you give a label to their kids. So suddenly, my kid has an attention deficit disorder. Okay? It's just not a normal kid who is bored at school and want to play instead of listening to a boring teacher. We put a label, he has attention deficit disorder. And then once you have a label, you have a drug, of course. Coming next month, there is a drug for this label. So this is not the fault of neuroscience, but it kind of comes with it, this view of education as putting people with medical labels. That's scary for me.
Thank you. And Todd, I bet you have an answer.
Yeah, no, actually, I think that's a really important point, which is, as someone who has historically been interested in the relationship to neuroscience education, I'm profoundly skeptical of what its value proposition is. I think it does some things really well, but this idea of carrying over, like the field of neuroscience is probably the most infant of the fields that we're talking about here. We really are barely getting our conceptual footing about, right? It's essentially, for the past 20 years, it's been glorified phrenology, right? Like, instead of which bump on your head, it's which structure part of the brain does this thing, right? That's clearly not the right way to think about it, but I worry the same way he does, that we're carrying over a set of pretty naive assumptions. This medical model that even medicine doesn't follow, right? Like, and we're saying if the kid is bored, they have an attention deficit, and now there's a drug that follows, and that terrifies me to no end. But I do think, to the other point, and hopefully we can talk about this a little bit later, I think this issue of personalization of learning, if we do it right, if we think about things like individuality for society's sake, right? So it's not just like personalized learning so kids can be rugged individualists, right? Like, but rather a deeper knowledge of who they are, a more effective, enjoyable learning experience, and that self-knowledge that to me is the foundation for being part of a community.
Thank you. Others?
I'd like to add to that. I mean, I can say from running a business and being in the professional world and working with a lot of other businesses as clients of mine, I've seen there's a real value. In particular, I work with startup companies. You know, people are successful there when they can identify their own individual strengths and weaknesses. They can then put together teams of people who complement them. That's a real strength. There is a risk, of course, of then pigeonholing yourself, where you then only focus on your strengths and you ignore the weaknesses. And I'm sure that's a risk in education as well. But there is something really valuable to certainly in the business or professional world, to knowing what you do well. And if the response to it is to then learn how to collaborate with other people in ways that complements your strengths and weaknesses, I agree, not to just have an individualized approach to it. And I'm curious here about the educators, about if there's anything being done in that regard in teaching. Certainly when I was coming up through school, there was no emphasis on that at all.
Yeah. Indeed. Stefan, do you have an opinion?
Yeah, I was looking at it in, you were talking about the analytics of it, or Conrad, I think, was mentioning about the analytics and the responsibility of the human to take on board these analytics in an ethical or appropriate way anyway. But in fact, in this world of big data, by definition, big data entails the fact of having big data, a lot of data, and in fact, particular situation of a kid at school, or of a typical, untypical case of a kid that would need special attention would go out of this big data, because by definition, it is a specific case. And in fact, this big data approach, the mining approach of the big data, goes along with that trend of the society of taking up the scoop of the sort of low-hanging fruit of the result of this analytics, and leaving out what are the sort of niche kind of analysis, which would need more human attention or more specific attention, or which have a deficit of training data, as we said in analytics, and then these are left out. It's a bit like in the e-commerce for recommendation system. You would have a lot of recommendation on very popular items, but in fact, if you like very specific music or very specific movie genre, these would suffer a deficit of recommendation. So because they have a lack of data, a lack of user addict, or so basically in education, this would mean that you would do mass education in a way if you follow the analytics.
Maybe not. To be a bit optimistic, maybe it's the other way around. In research and education, I've always used categories. And we have these famous aptitude treatment interaction laws. So if we have somebody who is field dependent or field independent, who is more auditive or more visual, somebody who is anxious, non-anxious, we will not use the same methods. And when we use ANOVAs to run our research, we needed to have these discrete categories to classify learners. Okay? And this is an extreme simplification of human complexity. Like one of the popular categories today is learning style. We have surface learner and deep learners. Okay, and we know that I can be a surface learner when I learn German, and a deep learner.
Verdammt cool. You think bandwidth between two places like Cambridge and Geneva?
Child falls in one of these categories.
Can we go?
And
Sorry, Pierre.
with
Pierre.
data, we might.
Pierre, sorry, you froze for a moment. So you were talking about surface learner versus deep learners, and we lost you. Could you go back there?
Okay, let me defreeze. I was saying that you can be a deep learner when you learn paragliding because you want to land safely, and a surface learner when you learn German because you are not so motivated. So we don't belong to categories across all topics and all moments of our life. Mm-hmm. So this simplification of reality, dividing students into learning style, cognitive style, whatever, was more or less due to the level of statistical tools that we had in the past. Today, maybe we can go, and that was my point about individualization, we can go further into having parametric models, like we're not anxious and unanxious, but you are somewhere in between, and that identify really one individual.
But the danger is always that you have a finite set of dimensions. So this surface versus non-surface, anxious versus non-anxious. And maybe there are some extra dimensions that you didn't actually discover. And you want actually still to reduce the view of your person with only these dimensions, whereas you may escape actually to any of the categories because of one of the specific dimensions. I mean, coming from another planet, for example, imagine that.
Yeah, but in the past, we could cope with 2 dimensions or 3.
Yeah, okay.
Now we can cope with 50. That's an improvement.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. So, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, continue on, Geneva.
I'm saying that there will always be some form of simplification because by definition, the machine will always find a category to put you in. There is, in general, not I don't know category.
Well, so I'd love to respond because, you know, you've just written a book on the end of average, and this is exactly the topic that you're addressing, how to personalize it to a clear degree.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think that Pierre was right. Like, you think about, we have these models and methods like ANOVA, which was designed for aggregate data, and it actually is terrible at detecting interactions. Like, it does not have the ability to really do that, and it cuts people up into categories. That's fine. It was a tool for another time, really. What kind of keeps me up at night is that with bigger data and better techniques, we can actually, we'll still simplify, but we can actually get better models of individuality. But you have to make that choice up front. It really matters how you structure the kinds of data you collect, the intervals in which you collect it. And what worries me is, so like to this point about like whether we force a certain set of parameters on everyone, probably the most famous example right now is in personality theory, right? So the big 5 personality shows up at the macro level as by far the best explanation for factors of personality. Like, it is the most replicated thing. It's so true in the population and fails miserably at the individual level. Like when you do these dynamic models of individual personality, you know, your personality may be described by 2 factors and mine by 3. But yet we're forcing everyone, you know, and it becomes very practical when, for example, you know, 85 out of the 100 Fortune 100 companies use personality tests based on 5-factor models to hire people, right? So I think that if we make some choices about having a principled way to think about individuality, right, it's still going to be simplified, but we may get closer to actually doing something a little more personal. I'll just end with this part, which is I'm a big believer in the ultimate personalization is going to be helping me understand who I am and have some agency. But if we embed false models of who you are, then I'm actually teaching you to see yourself in a completely wrong way that is actually going to hurt you, I think, in the long run, where we would have been better off to just leave you alone.
So completely understood. And let's go back to the point that was made in Geneva. That's if it's based on 5 parameters, it's extremely reductionist and it breaks down. But what if it's based on 500 parameters? It may be a still reasonable level of granularity at the individual level and still benefit from aggregated data, right?
Yeah.
So in essence, we can't completely escape a reductionist approach. We just have to broaden it to be more all-encompassing.
Yeah, and there's 2 things I think have been pretty interesting in the field of personalized learning so far. One has been there's new methods around things like what we call idiographic filtering, ways that we can actually aggregate people that allow you to generalize and predict, so you can make use of other people's data. And then the second thing is around open student models, where you actually reveal, instead of pretending that the machine somehow really knows you well, you engage the learner and expose these as hypotheses, and allow them to understand what the machine's doing and what it doesn't really understand, and allow that conversation to happen, which seems to promote more metacognition than would otherwise happen.
Rick, you're nodding.
Yeah, it's a fascinating discussion. When we think about neuroscience as novices in an engineering school that are trying to teach people how to calculate, I'm struck most by the early work that Howard Gardner put out about multiple intelligences, that the way people make decisions involves many different factors, many of which we're not even aware of. And it's those factors that we're not aware of that seem to be increasing in importance as we look into the future. I think it's Conrad who is pointing out that living together is a very important thing going forward. I believe that's in the classroom, that's collaboration, and that's the ability to learn how to learn as a group. That's not something that everybody is skilled at when they arrive in college. It's not something that we as a society encourage much. Most of the testing orientation in schools today argues that you should not talk to your neighbor. You should put your pencil down when the time's up, and it's all about individual assessment. It creates a great deal of conflict in students' minds about what it means to work on a team. And yet, as you look together at the future, the grand challenges that we're facing today are enormous. We have 7 billion people today, on the way up to 9 billion by 2050. We had 1 billion in 1920. I don't think there's any aspect of life that won't be affected by that. The technology is running away very quickly, enabling smaller and smaller number of people in each generation to affect the lives of a larger and larger number of other people, either intentionally or unintentionally, either for the good or not. And what's needed, I believe, in order to save us from ourselves is the ability to talk across political boundaries, across disciplines, and across time zones, and to collaborate. So I personally feel there's an urgency to shifting our paradigm in education to emphasize the ability to collaborate and to work together with people who think differently.
Yeah. Just to say, I love that, and I think that I constantly struggle, but I think it's in a good way with, at the core, we have to be a little more focused on individuality, and it can't become individualism. Right. You know what I mean? Like, to think of the system can batch process and then hope that we'll know ourselves and know each other is just not going to happen. But at the same time, a lot of the business models push toward algorithmic kinds of approaches where you don't get patents for helping me collaborate, right? Like, not necessarily. But I do think it's, I do think there's a lot of hope around thinking of having getting away from an old mindset or way we thought about people, right? The thing that I'm terrified about is we're going to take a 19th century view of individuals and put it into like this amazing 21st century technology, and we're just going to get this like on steroids version of super simplistic things. But so I'm pretty hopeful because I think we actually have a science around individuality, paradoxically, right? Like principle when you think about it, and we have technologies, if we make the choices, would allow us to create these environments, allow us to know ourselves and know each other. But I think it requires some really important decisions to be made early on.
Frank, you're an educator, and you have been for a long time.
No, I'm just listening to this.
like to chime in on something. It sounds like part of what we're talking about, and I'm saying this not as a professional educator, is to what extent should we be relying on large amounts of data to draw conclusions? I remember when people first started using the term big data, it was probably 6-7 years ago. I thought it was great that people outside of the scientific and engineering community might become more interested in making decisions based on actual empirical evidence. And now I think we've swung a bit too far in the direction of overly relying on the data as if it is the ultimate conclusion. I agree with Conrad, we need to be looking at the analytics. We used to call them statistics. And people people then knew that statistics could be manipulated to draw any conclusion you wanted. I don't know if people have forgotten that now that we're calling them analytics. So I think the general public now perhaps has developed some kind of a bias towards accepting the data as if it dictates a certain conclusion, and we need to find a way to integrate the data into the decision making, but leave the ultimate decisions to us. And I think as educators are saying here, I'll leave it to them. How do we mix the use of general large sets of data with individualized approaches, not just in education, but in other fields? I certainly hope we get back to more of a balance.
My stats professor, Judy Singer, was fond of saying statistics, and I think it's true for analytics now, is just the process of turning assumptions into conclusions, right? And like we often forget that there's no magic there.
Of course, there's an entire aspect of causality, not just correlation, etc. So, Geneva, your thoughts and comments?
Yes, on the individual versus social discussion, there is no individual brain. I mean, we are individual piece of hardware, or meat is individual, but the software is social. Our brain is a social machine. Our thinking is shaped by language, and Vygotsky won. Piaget lost, Vygotsky won. So today we are social completely. So even if we are alone, naked on an island, we are social machines. And our identity, we talk a lot about identity, is our identity a bit more than the sum of the ways we are perceived by other people. Our identity is a lot distributed over the way that all people around us look at us.
And Pierre?
Yes. Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
No, I'll come in after you've responded, because I wanted to make a separate point.
Okay, so Pierre, one thing I think is really important is, so from my perspective, I'm part of what we call the science of the individual, and what I think is interesting is the principled ways we think about individuality, in fact, brings us closer to seeing ourselves as not individuals, that like we're completely contextualized social people, and that it's fundamentally about interactions and modeling those and taking those seriously. So I think it's exciting as we get to understand individuality and seeing us as embedded social people and taking that seriously in a way that we haven't before.
Yeah, we clearly have something, individual. The guy who will sleep with my wife tonight is probably me, so it's the same, it's not another person. There is a continuity in the meat being included within my clothes. So there is something, but at the same time, I was in the PISA expert group, PISA is international comparison, and the last one was about collaboration skills. And many of, I must say, the American members of the panels, when we're talking about teamwork, the key word was leadership. The key quality of the team member was leadership. So that there, I think, we have a small cultural shift.
Yeah, indeed.
Yes. Just to add to this, it's interesting, how Charles was talking about the media and how the media takes great pleasure in spewing out these sound bites that emblematize the sort of paradoxical, difficult age we're living in. And something that has become very popularized, I think, is this idea that education, and more specifically even than that, schools, will find solutions to just about all the problems that are out there. And I think in sort of Northern Hemisphere, Western societies, collapse in cultural tissue, in religion, and other institutions has led to schools becoming a type of new religion, where you're meant to find the solutions to the world's future problems. You're meant to create happy young people who are living in a severely dysfunctional world in all sorts of ways, and that we're putting a little bit too much on the shoulders of schools and education, and we need to remind ourselves that a lot of these deep human questions are much more wide scale in the root of their problem than I think an educational response could really address entirely. But nonetheless, all of this to say that, and this is a platitude, something that I think is happening more and more in schools, and this is a response to Charles' question: how can human intelligence shoulder machine intelligence? Schools are places where children need to be away from their iPhones. You need to close your screen for just a little bit. You don't have to be, checking out your WhatsApp account or whatever it is over lunch. You can talk to other people. You can do sport. It's that old Greek idea of, socializing, of the skole being a place for happiness, for simplicity, for human relationships to flourish. And we mustn't turn schools into dreary sort of learning machines, because kids actually need that time, and parents are showing us this anxiety more and more in school to just grow up without all the noise and all the pressure that's around them. So I think learning to live with technology in schools, increasingly in the 21st century, is about knowing when to shut technology down and saying we're not going to have any right now. And I'm talking about technology in a very simplistic sense here of sort of devices. So that's part of what I think is increasingly on the landscape. And just to finish, I think there's also an irony that there's a more and more conservative approach to some of the more mechanical, lower order skills that young people should be able to harness, because increasingly parents, I find they're worried that children are coming out of, they're not coming out of a sort of 19th century paradigm. They're coming out of a post-Sputnik sort of phonetic spelling, dearth of general knowledge, very poor arithmetic and linguistic ability era. And what they want, in fact, is old school sort of education to make sure that there's a kind of baseline rigor. So there's a kind of curious regressive pattern going on as well. I think there's a false dichotomy that we sometimes create between the 19th century and the 21st century. But we forget that, the sort of second half of the 20th century involved what some people would describe as a sort of disaster in education in many countries because of a lack of all of these baseline skills that and knowledge sets that are actually needed. So all that to say that, that it's complex and it sort of goes in many directions.
So Conrad, you've described basically an education with a capital E, going back to Confucius and Socrates, rather than something that has become more narrow in its definition over the past few decades, because, well, we can go on the reasons related to assessment types and so on. But so that's I think understood by very many and agreed on. So again, here even the monikers will matter, because calling it old school actually, unfortunately, paints it in an unfavorable way. Whereas when we talk about a broader education going to what has been known about human nature all the way to the Greeks and Confucius, puts it in a light of a comprehensive education rather than a narrow education, which is your point. I completely get that. So in that context, I would like to ask a question, a provocative question. Oh, I'm sorry, Frank, go ahead.
I had a question, just a comparative question. I mean, to this point, this is really a question for Geneva. To this point, we've been talking about education in a kind of general way as if every child in the country gets more or less the same education. In this country at this point, education is very stratified. I mean, by the kind of advantages and the kind of preparation and so on that a child gets is very heavily tied to income. And I wondered whether that was true in Switzerland at this point, or whether there's more equality in terms of the kind of education or the quality of education different children get, or how that plays out.
Maybe I can. We did not hear all the question, but I think I got the point. One characteristic of Switzerland is the consistency of the educational system. So we have 10 universities, half of them are in the top 100 in the world. For a small country, 2 of them are in the top 20, so very good universities. But we have also very good University of Applied Science, very close to universities. And then we have very good Berufsbildungsschule, vocational education, carpenters, plumbers are trained for 4 years. So when I go to the States, sometimes I have my friend from Boston or Stanford who are so smart, and then you go downtown and there is this huge gap. And you know, I remember this supermarket where nobody in the supermarket could compute 20% of $80. Nobody. And so yeah, the strength of this system is that we have layers, if you want, but these layers are really close to each other.
So the dispersion of the results is much narrower in Switzerland than it is in the US.
Every plumber in this country did 4 years of study. He speaks probably 3 languages, and he had some accounting and so on. So that's part of the quality of life. To, you know, this basically only a small fraction of the society escape from education.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask a question about the what of an education, you know, in any system for that matter. So let me start with a provocative sentence you hear every once in a while. Google knows everything. What's your reaction to even that?
Well, you know what my reaction to that is? That's a bit like saying a book knows everything. But that, a book knows nothing. You have to open it and read it to know what's there.
Good. Stefan? Stefan?
Yeah, I think Google stores everything, probably not everything and not the perfect way. And I mean, a book you can read. Can you really read what all Google has stored? That's the big problem of the big data. I mean, it's there, but how to read it? So I really very much agree with that idea of between storing or containing and being able to be legible. There's a huge difference. That's true. And in fact, there's also an interpretative difference, which may lead to ethical questions. You know, the same data can be read very differently from different people, perspective, backgrounds, whatever.
And it seems that in the statement, you're confusing everything with factoids. If we're just talking about factoids, then they do pretty well. But when you're talking about sort of how things fit together, that's a whole different set of issues.
Yeah, I remember, I'll probably be the only person to quote Kissinger here, I guess. But
no, some of us remember.
Okay,
that.
good. So
Good.
he was speaking at Google, and he said, he chided them saying, like, facts don't speak for themselves. That's not the point. And you confuse this, but interpretation is everything.
Yeah.
And I think as soon as we start to accept even saying things like Google knows everything, I think it's a very scary path we go down where we start to assume that that is the knowledge, right? Versus, first of all, there's all kinds of flaws in the way that they surface information and what they've said, but I think interpretation is everything.
Okay, so let's take the argument to the next level. The response that comes back to this sort of conversation is, okay, fine, it doesn't quote unquote know, and it's not everything, but it's a large amount of things, and it's not necessarily known, but it's accessible. And therefore, if it's accessible, why should I know? And so again, what are your responses to that?
But maybe let me repeat what Konrad said. Or take an example. If the speed of light is incompressible, then time is elastic. This is a sentence that I read on the door of a colleague. If the speed of light is incompressible, then time is elastic. It's information that I have stored and I can retrieve. It's information. It's not knowledge. It means nothing for me. I understand every single word, but I'm not a guy from physics, so I understand it is not knowledge for me. I cannot do anything with this sentence. If you ask me, Pierre, there is a train that crosses the control station at the speed of light, and with one person with a flash taking a picture, and there are two mirrors, and this kind of physics problem, I cannot solve it. So, it's information. It's not knowledge. We can store information, that bits, but not knowledge.
And even less understanding, of course.
No, it's not understanding. It's the ability to use it to do something.
Yeah.
I mean, in a certain sense, one, you can compare Google, or at least in daily life, I compare Google right now to Ben Franklin's developing bifocals. I mean, it took a tremendous burden off of people when their eyes began to age, that they didn't have to rely on the eyes. They could use that well. The same thing is true with memory. I mean, people ask me about some event or some person, and I can't remember the name, but I can certainly phrase the question well enough for Google to do it. Well, that's terrific. It makes my life a lot easier, but that's a very narrow kind of job.
Correct. So now, of course, it does have an impact. The Greeks were bemoaning the emergence of the alphabet because people didn't have to memorize the Iliad anymore. And so clearly our memorization skills have dropped down because we haven't had to memorize as much right at the time where the amount of knowledge started ramping up. And now, of course, it has ramped up exponentially. And so the question that comes back now is, okay, well, fine, we have access to a ton of information. What does it exactly mean? Because it's not just factual information, we also have procedural information. If you generalize a search engine to YouTube and videos and things like that, you do have procedural information available as well. So this is the sophistication of the conversation I'd like to go into. What does this imply?
Well, I'm intrigued by so to your point about people complaining about print in general, right? And there's a trade-off, right? But once we had, you could actually put to paper different kinds of information and compare. You got whole ways of thinking, syllogisms, logic that we think is because you can take for granted accessibility to this information. So what's interesting is to think, if Google's taken that and gone crazy with it, what kinds of new ways of thinking emerge off of taking for granted this kind of accessibility?
Well, exactly. And so in Geneva, if we could unmute them, I'm curious about, again, going back to the data analysis aspect of this. Have we lost them?
No.
Okay.
We are, yeah.
So to Stefan, perhaps. To Stefan, perhaps.
Yes.
If you mind answering Todd's comment.
So sorry, I didn't catch all of the.
Okay.
Try to restart it. It doesn't echo.
Okay, we're gonna.
Just a few more years.
Say your question.
Okay. So Stefan, based on Todd's commentary, you lose things, you gain others, you gain new abilities. The fact that even we have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, I think, of books available on Google Ngram opens new possibilities. We don't have to read them, but we can extract value out of patterns we find in them. And, an amusing little game is to find out how often your own first name has appeared in literature, in English literature, since the 1800s, and you see when your name was particularly popular. But there, beyond those little games, there's of course linguistics and all sorts of historical analysis that can emerge. So Stefan, would you like to take that on?
Yeah, well, I think one of the, the fact that we have a sort of encyclopedia accessible very easily in a very direct manner from Google or from whatever the net, or from videos or music or whatever. I think this is a support. Again, that's what I was having as a point in the early time of this conversation. It's a support, but in fact, there's intelligence is just not being able to output individual items of knowledge. So meaning that I would be able to give the definition of a single word. I need to contextualize it into some of a broader background knowledge. And in fact, not memorizing, this requires memorization. So if people don't memorize and rely only every time they cross something to ask Google what this is and how to react to it, then you have a very kind of punctual, decorrelated, decontextualized action, if you see what I mean. So in fact, you will always need this kind of background, memorization, summarization, and compression of the data, which is one thing that education provides to me, to understand whatever Google or whatever encyclopedia will return you back as a definition to contextualize whatever this knowledge is. That's my understanding. And in fact, it's not so much a problem to store and retrieve punctual data, respond very specific queries, as we say in information retrieval. It's more of a problem to summarize, for example, or to derive new knowledge out of, to induce new knowledge out of a mass of big data or whatever we call it. So basically, just stop memorizing is not a way to go, I think. It's a wrong way to go. Maybe memorizing some pointers and summarizing is right, but we will not save the effort of memorizing data.
Thank you. Yes, please. Thank you. Yes, please.
Totally agree with all this, and I think that one of the things. So we already know, for example, that the presence of Google is affecting even the way our brains store memories, right? So there's some pretty pioneering studies showing if you're told that you'll be able to search for it later, the memory you form is how to find it, not the actual information, which isn't necessarily bad, right? But when we go back to the trade-offs issue, right? So you get print as a given, and there's new ways of thinking that emerge. But something else that happens is there's often new skills that need to be acquired to make the trade-off worth it. So if you're going to go to a print-based world instead of oral tradition, literacy becomes vital to making that trade-off worth it for you, right? And you saw back in the day that the elites just hoarded that skill, right? It was a power grab to say, we're not going to let you be able to read. That way we can keep control. And I think if we think through what people like Google, what that's doing, and what kind of skills become really vital, and that we ensure a more equitable distribution of the ability to acquire those skills.
Yeah, absolutely. Rick?
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. I think that Google has provided a platform that allows us to move up a little bit higher on Bloom's taxonomy in the classroom, so that we don't have to concentrate on what you remember, but instead focus on what you can do with what you know, being more creative. There's some analogies here that we've been through before. I'm just old enough to have been in engineering school before computing. And we used to carry around truth tables that had numbers printed page after page after page for what the sine and the cosine and the tangent and all these things were. We spent a lot of time trying to analyze what those functions look like from a calculus point of view, even memorizing things like Taylor's theorem that allowed you to construct it in case you left your tables at home. Now you have hand calculators that have buttons on them to do all this for you. You can almost think about this in terms of the time that kids spend in multiplication tables. Why do we do that? The cost of a small electronic calculator is so small today. Is it worthwhile to do that? Why do we do that? And of course, if there is no other way to do it, a large fraction of time in the classroom is spent making sure that you're competent in multiplication or you understand what trigonometry is about. Today, because that is almost in the air, it enables us to think at a higher level. And I think that Google is going to have an effect there too. If you imagine that the historic purpose of education has been to transmit knowledge, and the way that that happens is that we have people with PhDs who are supposed to be the experts, and that's why we get PhDs, so that their knowledge is more extensive, and we use them to talk to large groups of people in the classroom. Then we have to figure out what they know. And in a sense, this is a game we're codifying now. It's a little bit like asking everybody to play Jeopardy, the TV game. I'm not sure if our Geneva folks know what Jeopardy is, but it's a TV game in which sort of random facts are brought up in different categories, and it's a quick recall and contextualization. You may have known about the Watson computer playing Jeopardy. I think Google has made that completely irrelevant now. While you're playing the Jeopardy game, somebody can Google the answer and get it before you can. So who's going to pay you for that kind of an education now? So I think the economic value of perfect test scores in that kind of a learning environment has gone down, and I think that's probably permanent. So now it matters more what you can do with what you know. Unless you can make useful predictive models of the future based on the information that you get from Google and elsewhere, your value in the marketplace is lower. So I think it's a big deal.
So we're going to be taking a 10-minute break. I would like you to ponder a response to this, but also think basically in terms of automaticity trade-offs, meaning is it plausible that we will also be going through life every 2 seconds going and checking facts and looking at things? There's also a certain amount of background data that we would have to just function on a regular basis. The question becomes what background data matters today versus what used to matter before. So we don't need necessarily the log tables, but perhaps we still do need multiplication tables. And that's the second refined conversation that needs to take place about what information matters and how much of it. So let's reconvene in 10 minutes, Geneva. We're starting again. And for this, for this third and last period, what we're going to do is continue the conversation. Then at some point towards the end, perhaps 15, 20 minutes before the end, I would like to open it up to the audience we have here in Boston to have them ask questions of anyone they wish to ask questions of. But to get us started again, going back to this issue of automaticity and just a practical aspect, we all live with a lot of knowledge in our heads, some understanding even of that knowledge, and that helps us function on a routine basis. It gives us context, it gives us automaticity. I'd like to explore that a bit, have your thoughts about how will we think through, what is a process perhaps to think through what matters versus what doesn't matter? What can we be relying on for databases everywhere in the cloud versus what we should have already present in us? So I think Pierre has wishes to speak up.
I think human animals have a lot of nostalgia. So we live a lot and we think a lot of education by thinking that the past was better. And like phone numbers, we don't memorize phone numbers anymore. Okay, we used to. Now we have a name on the phone and we click on the name, so we don't have to. And is there any usefulness? Yeah, there are some cases in the life where you don't have your phone and you should call someone with another phone, blah blah blah. But all these things that we teach at school, we were discussing that with Conrad over the break, that we just teach because we have always taught them, like the decimal systems, okay? 1 meter, 1 decameter, 1 hectometer. How did you hectometer? Did you run today? And we continue to teach this because we are supposed to teach decimal systems. So to answer your question, every time, so Google and so on, they are cognitive prostheses. So they extend our cognition, and every prosthesis unskill you because you don't practice the skill that this prosthesis is doing for you. And sometimes you get rid of the prosthesis, like you learn to swim with a buoy, and at some time you get rid of it, otherwise you never swim. Sometimes you don't get rid of it, like, no, I managed to read thanks to my glasses, and I cannot escape from this anymore. But so, I mean, we have to accept that the knowledge we need is changing, and some of them will not be there anymore. We've had this discussion many times, but, and you know, we could carry on for a long time, but if I look today, my kids who are always in Google, what they know today, what my parents knew when they left school, my kids know 100 more times about the world, about everything, than my parents who were memorizing poems and facts and had a better spelling and everything like that knew. I mean, my parents were kind of in the middle age compared to what my kids know today. And so beyond the discussion about having tools unskill us, having schools that perform cognitive function like pocket calculator unskill humans, globally speaking, if you look in 2 generations, for me, the knowledge has been multiplied. The knowledge in the memory of an adult has been multiplied by 100. And you said, should we memorize? But we never not memorize. We always memorize. I mean, our brain is recording all the time. So there is not what we call memory exercise at school, which is rote learning, but we always memorize. When we Google, we don't maybe memorize the definition, but we memorize the information is stored, collected, organized, and so on. Okay, stop.
Thank you, Pierre. Yes, Conrad, go ahead. Yes, Conrad, go ahead.
Yeah, 2 points. So one is that I think knowledge gives us pleasure, and the more you know about something, the more beautiful your experience of that thing will be. So if you look at a work of art and you have historical understanding of the symbols in that work of art, I think that you might gain a richer spiritual appreciation of the works. I do think that part of the purpose of an education, and this is an eternal construct, or in any case, it's timeless, I'd say, is to be able to appreciate the world. And you can't appreciate the world if you're ignorant. It's not by looking up on Wikipedia, what the symbolism of the lamb is in Grunewald's crucifixion, that you're going to have a rich textured appreciation of it. Now, if that leads to a deeper and broader sort of reading around that symbol, and then you to go back and contemplate the work, perhaps it will. But I think that's one point, that there is the pleasure factor, and that your life can be richer and more interesting if you have more knowledge. Not just academic knowledge, not just scientific or literary or historical knowledge. Of course, knowledge is contextual, so that can shape itself in many different ways. So that's the first point. And the second one is that in the 21st century, with all the social problems that we're living through, I think we should be teaching international history, and we should be teaching literature with an intercultural perspective, so that we're using the study of history and the study of literature to open learners' minds as much as possible to the wonderful diversity of the world. And there are other areas that I think we can adapt in the curriculum because of the world we're living in. So that's just one small example.
Thank you, Conrad. Thank you, Conrad. So you brought up global competencies. In essence, if I can generalize, it's back to saying what we learn has to change. Some things fade and some things come up. We don't teach Greek and Latin routinely anymore. There's a valid practical reason for that versus, let's say the utility function of other things. And so some of these emerge. And also you're pointing to the fact that it's also a question of pleasure. beyond the competencies for a practical purpose, in as much as pleasure is not quote unquote practical. So, Rick?
Yes, I think there's a need for all of the knowledge that Google has categorized. I don't think it's a matter of deliberately ignoring or discarding stuff, but there is a really important growing need to learn how to learn, and to learn how to learn in context and with groups. So let me just illustrate this. One of our close friends has been involved with a complete change in learning paradigm in medicine. I think this is not unique to Harvard, but this happened, the case study that I'm aware of is at Harvard, where in the first year, they changed the learning method from one in which you took 6 or 7 lecture courses in basic sciences like anatomy, physiology, microbiology, and so forth. And then in the next year, you would do the laboratory science. And finally, in the third year, you would run into patients. And Dean, I think his name was Tosteson, some years ago concluded that this was not working because students could not remember the science and apply it in context when they saw real patients. So the sequencing was bad. And he also foresaw that the rate at which new knowledge was coming up was so expansive and so rapid that it was unreasonable to think that they would learn everything they need to know and have it stored in their memory bank before they saw a patient. And maybe that was a completely wrong way of thinking about education. So instead, they re-engineered it in something called the New Pathways program, in which in the first year, students took no lecture courses, or at most one. And they put them in small groups and tutorials, and they dealt with real patients. So I went down and watched this, and it was amazing. So there's this group of like 5 or 6 first-year medical students. They maybe had 1 hour of lecture during that day. And the rest of the day was devoted to a case in which they came in and put a manila folder on the table and says, here's the case of Mrs. Smith. She was in the ER last night with severe headaches. The MRI scan for Mrs. Smith is in this folder. What's wrong with Mrs. Smith? And then the instructor sat in the corner. And he says, I'll answer any questions you have about this material, but you need to find out what's wrong. And they immediately looked at each other and they said, Frank, why don't you go to the library and read everything you can find on headaches, and I'll see if I can find someone who can tell me what this funny picture that they call an MRI is trying to say. They met back again at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The instructor put another folder down. He says, there's the blood work on Mrs. Smith. Now what's wrong with her? This method characterized the entire first year. They, at the end of the semester, had to stand in front of the entire medical class and faculty and explain what was wrong with Mrs. Smith. There was a great deal of emphasis on being accurate at that point. Now, of course, this raises a lot of questions, but did they ever learn the anatomy and the physiology? The big test was what happens when they take the medical licensing exam. And because that's quite traditional and it involves content knowledge. And the answer is yes, they did learn it because they passed at the same rate as the kids who had the more traditional method, but they had this other skill of learning how to learn on their own. That kind of new thinking about education, I believe, is important and should be incorporated at the early stages of education and not just medical school.
If I may build on that, this is, I'm thinking how I've learned in my own day-to-day work as a lawyer. It's from practicing, having experiences, direct experiences, and learning from them. I'd say in a typical day as a lawyer, I don't look up anything on Google in order to answer questions for clients, in part because mostly what they're coming to me for is not factual answers about anything. It's advice about what actions to take, what to do, based on my experience. And they'll actually often phrase it in that way. Sometimes they may not, but they'll ask, Robert, based on your experience, what should I do in this situation? And I'll answer based on my direct experience of working every day with clients like them in similar situations. And that's nothing I'd ever get from Google. So that's a whole realm of, I wouldn't even call it knowledge. Maybe it is kind of knowledge. You might call it wisdom or practical knowledge that Google is not replacing anytime soon.
Right. So we've addressed, of course, the aspects of appropriate knowledge, knowledge for pleasure, knowledge in situ, in context with skills and character, meta-learning. Let me bring us back to what we were discussing about technology enhancing that process, okay? And let me take a crude analogy. I'm sure that when the wheel was invented, there was someone who said, you know what, this is all nice and good, but I'd rather walk. And whereas their colleagues said, okay, well, I'll go faster, further, with less fatigue, and carry heavier loads. So as we all understand, it's a question of balance, where to use the technology appropriately, not as a panacea, but as a true enhancer. Can we have a conversation now about, well, what is the role of an intelligent agent, an intelligent tutor helping you along the way? And perhaps coupled with technologies such as virtual reality to help us experience those medical conditions, etc., in a way that enhances learning. So who would like to tackle this?
Yeah, I'd like to back up one step, actually, because I think in something that Conrad said, I think that the technology now is serving these sort of two, in some sense, contradictory roles. On the one hand, it's creating very uneven disruptions in the economy in terms of job loss and so on. On the other hand, it allows people to really live much more in their own universe, getting opinions that they agree with, and really cutting off contact among groups in the economy. I mean, in some sense, much more informationally segregated than would have been true. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, at least there was a sense in the late 40s of this sort of common experience of a large part of the population living through the Second World War. Many had lived through the Great Depression. There were sort of common reference points. That's breaking down, and technology is enabling that to break down, I think, much faster in terms of getting opinions that agree with your own. So there's this stuff going on the one hand, and more people are unaware of it on the other hand. And I guess the best example in the last 3 or 4 weeks is this sudden kind of re-estimation, this rediscovery of just how much damage the Chinese trade really had done to certain communities that was just kind of passed over by my profession, because, well, we sort of know about trade adjustments. So it turns out not true at all. We didn't know about it.
Can you say more about that, actually, the damage?
Well, I think that the standard story that most economists had in their head was that international trade creates kind of modest disruptions and people readjust and move into new sectors and so on and so forth. And to the extent that there are real big job losses, I think 10 years ago, most people would have said it's more due to technology than trade. And then David Autor, who you've worked with and so on at MIT, and 2 other researchers went through and did a much more careful statistical analysis. And it turns out that within certain well-defined geographic areas, that the impact of Chinese trade in the first decade of this century had enormous negative impacts. There was much less adjustment than sort of the standard story would predict. And I think that the subtext of that was that people live sufficiently in their own worlds that some set of people are going through tremendous dislocation, and another set of people say, well, we know this trade theory, we know how this is working, and that's the end of it. Right. Well, that's no way to hold a society together.
Thank you. Geneva?
No, I concur. I think if you come back to schools, it's so important to have assemblies where you discuss together your values. You need to build up a sense of community. It's crucial, and technology is not always helping with that. In fact, so yeah, I certainly agree. I think the historical analogy is an interesting one as well.
Well, let me compare with another historical analogy, with his church. The generation before us, they were not much more. Their way of thinking was much more driven by what the priest would say at the church. So I don't know. It's when do we look back? Is it one generation or two generations? It changed the perspective. I agree that there is a bit of what is interesting is all this plot theory. Did you say that? Plot theory?
Yeah, conspiracy theory.
Conspiracy theory that emerged. That's scary. I agree, it's scary. But what about the weight of religion on the European society for the previous 1,000 years? That was not so good to hear.
No, of course. I mean, there's a balance between a sort of positivist, industrialized society and the Middle Ages. I think we have to pitch it somewhere between the two, or maybe somewhere else completely.
Right. Stefan?
Yeah, well, I think the technology is actually creating the illusion of a virtual community. If you ask, for example, my kids who are 15 and 13, they would say that they belong to a community. But for example, my daughter, she's a fan of mangas. So she's discussing a lot with Japanese person. She's never been to Japan, but she would say that she belongs to that community of Japanese art fans. And in fact, she belongs to a community that she has never met. So is it an illusion of belonging to a community with values, with some kind of common jargons, language, and everything? Or is it really something? Is it really something that will drive somehow education or a way of acquiring or looking at the world or of living in general? I mean, this I don't know. I mean, it's a daily battle for me to try to get her in touch with the world that she can actually touch, if you see what I mean. So technology there may not be so helpful.
Thank you, Stefan.
A little bit. I'm like probably most people, like incredibly shocked at the rate in the States in terms of the marriage equality movement and how fast, especially youth, have basically we've never seen anything like that ever, really. Like, I mean, it's incredible. And having two teenage boys, I wonder their ability to have, it's not the same as community, right? They don't have the same like deep connections, but their ability to interact with people, even in that superficial way, to know people that have different views, I felt like it seemed like it helped accelerate a sense of like, this is unfair to them. Whereas like I grew up in a rural part of the country where like I was like a minority because I had freckles, right? Like it was like, and I just feel like the pure lack of exposure, even at the most basic level, is so easy to lead to this very narrow view. And I don't know, so I feel like it does some things really well, even at a superficial level, in terms of exposing my kids to a whole bunch of different views.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that. Yeah, I think we don't know yet to what extent actual community a feeling can be developed using just digital technologies. So I'll say right now, when I leave today, I'll feel like I've formed a closer connection with the people physically sitting here, even the ones in the audience who I haven't spoken with, than my panelists, fellow panelists in Switzerland. And I think that has something to do with the fact that I'm a biological being, and we have some feeling that develops from being in the same physical place with each other. I know that people in the technology world have commented for years on, why do startups keep flocking to Silicon Valley if everything can be done remotely? It's because human beings develop some connection with each other better when they're in the same physical place. People are not all telecommuting all the time. So I think this is still really an open question about what kind of personal relationships and communities can be developed using technology, and to what extent are they different from the way those relationships and communities form in personal physical contact.
So from a learning perspective, we are able to collaborate across greater distances as we are right now. It does have a certain impact on our learning abilities. Yeah, please.
I'd like to comment a little bit on your question about mentorship and the role of personal relations in the future. Just mentioning the big data results from the Gallup organization with Brandon Bustede and his work with Purdue University, doing the analysis on many thousands of college graduates to back calculate what was it in their higher education experience that contributed most to their successful outcomes in life. And according to that report, mentorship played by far a largest role in this whole milieu of data. The idea that there was someone in your career who reached out to you after you finished your direct exposure in their classroom, followed your career progression, expressed encouragement and faith and belief in you as a person, got them through difficult decisions and made a huge impact on their life. The image that emerges is that this kind of mentorship sits somewhere on the yardstick between a teacher on one end and a parent on the other end. Mm-hmm. And this kind of personal relationship, which strikes me, having spent my whole career in higher education, is almost completely ignored on the annual faculty review form. I don't know what that kind of does on other universities. And yet this is what makes a difference in people's lives.
Yeah. Sorry. To this point, so I was taking part in some other work around online learning, and there's this intriguing new model that would speak to this a little bit. So on the one hand, something like Southern New Hampshire University, which has College for America, which $2,500 a year, all you can learn. Now, of course, it comes with all the problems of isolated online learning. And then there's this group called Match Beyond in Boston, which has said, wait a minute, what if we just added another $2,500 on top of that? It's still below Pell Grant, right? It's still way cheaper than even going to community college. And all they provide is mentorship and coaching and a place for you to come together. Someone's always thinking about you. It's not just academic, and they're just knocking it out of the park. And you think, maybe this is how we start to think about using the technology, right? Mm-hmm. Drive that price point down and then spend some money on the relationship aspect.
Right, so it's the best of both worlds blending aspect. So, Geneva?
I disagree with the belief that online is not a true relationship, even if it's not biological. How many people married or divorced by Skype, by internet, by whatever? We see in our MOOCs, we produce 50 MOOCs with 1.2 million students. We teach students who send letters to the professors. Their dream is to meet the professor. And so still they want to meet physically once in their life, but they built a strong relationship just by watching videos of somebody who was not seeing them. So we should not believe that the online world is not social and emotional. They receive mail. I would come to Europe this summer. I would be so great to be able to meet you, and so on and so on. So the world is both. Is this mentorship, this personality things is very physical, and it also happens online. Last example. So I was a school teacher in Belgium 35 years ago. My kids found me on the internet. They made a party 35 years later, so they can confirm the study that you mentioned, that probably had an influence on their life, because we did the same picture again 35 years later. But they found me on internet. They followed the relationship on internet. So it's not that we are in a world that is online or physical. The online world is very physical. I mean, I still have a body when I speak to you online. So it's kind of an intellectual game to try to separate what is online and what is face-to-face.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, just piggybacking on that, I think where there's a will, there's a way. And Heckman's work on grit was being mentioned. We all know that if you really want to learn something, a few things can stop you. And perhaps it is the case, this has been my experience with online courses for students, that the more motivated ones tend to stay the course online. Whereas if you're trying to catch a learner, it's quite difficult to do that through a screen. If I want to learn something on a YouTube tutorial, that's perfectly good for me. But it's because I want to learn it. I want to go there. If you're telling me I have to go and learn my maths online and I don't want to, I'd probably be better off with a face-to-face teacher.
Well, I have a case study of a vocational school here, where we talk about MOOCs, and I said, oh, you are a vocational school, MOOCs are for academia. And the director told me, no, Pierre, wait a minute. I train carpenters, and then we fail the national exam because of the mathematics. So could you do some mathematics MOOC for my students? And we did with the professor of the school. And so they were forced to learn mathematics, but it was not their choice. And the professor produced the MOOCs, and then we did analytics and everything, and they said, that's not my students anymore. My students, I mean, they've been watching, my carpenter students were watching mathematics videos on Sundays. I would never expect that that this could happen. So even in the case when not a free decision to go and learn mathematics, we're extremely surprised by there are some other advantages, the fact that you can pause the professor, they can watch it 5 times and so on and so on. There were some advantages that you can do it whenever you have the time and so on. There were clear advantage for them.
Maybe it's because Pierre did the MOOCs and he was in them.
Stefan?
Yeah, I think, again, taking the sort of role of the technology guy, I think the technology may also add some augmenting. I mean, just the fact of being able to pause the teacher, but also to click on the teacher to know what, some more information, know more or whatever in these augmented videos or in this augmented material. So maybe the technology would add some dimensions that may not be so bad after all. I don't know. I think everything there's 2 sides of everything. So I think there's really something that could be exploited there, and there's a wealth of things that could be exploited in the right way.
Right. So if I may, no technology comes without its, impediments, dangers, bad sides, or whatever, but we always find a workaround when it's important enough. If holding a phone to your ear was to be proven to provoke cancers, well, you'd be using a headset instead, etc. You would not stop using the phone. So same for the cars, etc. So I think, to conclude, we're all saying it's a world of atom and bits, not a world of atom or bits. And it's the forever question is with what balance and when and where, and that's, the complexity that we will constantly have to deal with in the decades ahead. And so with that, I'd like to open the conversation to our colleagues here in Boston. And if you have any questions to ask of anyone on either side of the Atlantic, please, Amelia.
It seems like in terms of what people should learn, some of the things we're talking about are more towards the personal level, the developing expertise in particular areas, knowing oneself better, becoming better at handling relationships. Some of it pushes towards the global level and kind of understanding people across different cultural boundaries, understanding global problems more. We haven't really heard anything that suggests that things should be, what students should learn should be determined at the national or state level. But currently, the vast majority of what people learn in schools is determined at a national or state level. Does that suggest a need for rebalancing, or is it fundamentally important still that, the general body of knowledge or the general skills that everybody should be developing, that it's still appropriate that it should be determined at that level?
Well, I think we had a couple of comments earlier on talking about the importance of a shared
right. So
shared
is that
humanity
national or state, or
right.
is that international and global?
Well, and then hence the question, is it an and again, or an or, is it an or question or an and question, the rebalancing question, meaning leaving enough latitude for personal and local choices in addition to the standards that create a society that actually understands itself, other societies. So, Geneva, would you have an opinion on this?
Yeah, just very quickly, I'd like to say someone who works in international education, and we do an international curriculum, and I feel very passionately that that's an incredibly important body of knowledge to carry with you. Although it's difficult, of course, because it's untenably large. It's very important, nonetheless, to be rooted in the country where you are, and to know something of the culture, the history of, and to have some appreciation of the place where you live, if not where you come from. To talk of a global citizen is problematic, because you don't live in the world, you live in a country. And in this age of rampant globalization, where we're all speaking English, where you can sort of roam from one airport to the next, you know, we're losing, I think, an opportunity with the travel that we're able to accomplish to really not just be globalized tourists, but to actually travel the world and to connect with it deeply. And I think that should start with knowing something of your, when I say your own culture, let's at least say of the culture of the place where you're learning.
In Switzerland, you don't live in a country, you live in a canton.
Yeah, but that's important to know about Geneva, the canton and the Republic of Geneva, if you're living here.
Other question, yes, please. Other question, please.
Yeah. So my question, sorry, it's along lines of basic education. When we think about how technology can actually measure and assess skills that one needs. We kind of talked a little bit about metacognition earlier, things like that. But you know, my career as an education researcher, I don't know if I could tell you like the skills you need to do what I do. Really, I don't know if my boss could, maybe, you know. But my past career as a computer engineer, I could give you a much clearer sense of the skills that one would need to do, you know, design a computer processor, for example. And so how do you see technology kind of playing a role at scale to help us understand the actual skills people need in various, you know, capacities, not just maybe like a dev boot camp for, you know, a web developer, but across the spectrum, and how technology really scaling that moving forward?
Anyone would like to tackle this?
You're talking about technology for learning to learn?
Yeah, so if you call, I mean, metacognition, I guess you could say, is a skill one would need for engineering, let's say, and President Miller, you mentioned that. How can we scale that? Machine learning, adaptive learning, these tools that we kind of started talking a little bit about, even Google having all the information that is there, how to use that to scale development of those skills.
Would it take an intelligent tutoring system that knows when to recommend that the learner shift to talking to a human? Like somebody talked about that, where it's not because the machine can't handle it, but you're working through activities that say, okay, now's a good time to go work in a group, and you move them off the machine into something that's human intelligent, interactive.
I think that's right. I think we're getting, like, if I was king for a day, I want the technology to have essentially idiosyncratic intelligent tutoring systems, where it's like we know the kind of competencies we're trying to go toward, but that sort of interface needs to know me enough as an individual to understand this is the time that you should. I could do this for you, but actually you need to be building these things, and that's not something that's just generic, right? We can't. But I feel like we're going a different direction, where we can pretend to patent algorithms that do things to you and for you, right? And somehow it's all in the machine. But I think as educators, I think we need to draw a line in the sand and say that actually this kind of approach is something that we want to have happen.
The thing that you talked about reminds me of, there was an ad for a golf club that if you didn't swing it right, it had a hinge in the shaft.
Yep.
And you're supposed to swing it so that the hinge wouldn't activate and the shaft is going straight. And my brother's a golfer, says, that's not teaching you how to golf, it's teaching you how to swing that particular club so the hinge doesn't break.
I bought that club. It was absolutely awful.
What was awful about it?
It did not, exactly what you said. It absolutely does not translate into swinging my Callaway driver. Right? It just.
And I think a lot of it falls on that.
That's a great.
Well, so it's a transfer question again.
Yeah. Well, I got really good at not having the hinge snap.
We touched a little bit on some of the negative side effects of technology and globalization. For example, communities where everyone used to work in a factory are at a disadvantage in terms of the skills that they need to be competitive today. And we've talked a lot about education. I'm wondering specifically, how can we make the right investments in education and have the right education, sort of processes to start to combat that? do we invest, is just putting a lot of money into education going to help? Where does that money go? Is it funding college education? And how do we, just how do we apply education policy to help areas become better educated? Is it simply just teaching computer science and everyone in the program in Youngstown, Ohio, going to solve the problem? Or is it beyond? I don't know. It's sort of a general question. I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts.
I can only, I can give a couple of pieces of a rudimentary answer to that. I think that one of the issues is that when the bottom gets knocked out of a community like that, you're starting a process that really undermines education all the way through. Because the question is starting with, for example, where kids are when they start kindergarten, and how much enrichment they've had, and to what extent have they had exposure to reading and vocabulary and so on and so forth. And the problem then, sort of, to the extent that education is heavily locally funded in a situation like that, then you're talking about that cycle feeding on itself. Now, traditionally, historically, we said, well, when an area gets really hit like that, we expect people to move out. That's how we expect people to deal with it. And that has worked to a certain, to a large extent in the past, but in recent data, for one reason or another, people don't move. That was one of the experiences in the first 10 years here in this country, in the communities that were devastated. So on the one hand, I would say that you have to try and start putting in some support for what's being demolished. But it goes for more broadly than that, because if you look, say, in the last, since 2008, state support for public higher education has really been decimated. They've really cut back aid, and so tuition has gone up and so on and so forth. And if that's supposed to be the avenue to upward mobility, you're really cutting off the avenue. And so I think, we talked before about institutions. Institutions are really enormously, we got a lot of problems with institutions in this country right now, because they're the ones that and the kind of underlying spirit is going to determine what sort of remedies you're willing to undertake.
Scale.
Yes, please.
This is actually a question for Todd, and it goes back to your comment that one of the things we need more of in education is better feedback. And you were questioning, what the role of technology could be in that. And setting aside the idea of, perfect generalizable AI that could really understand every single thing about you and make all those perfect recommendations, including when to be quiet. I'm wondering what your thoughts are, maybe the next steps for improving the role of technology in giving feedback to students.
Yeah, so I actually think, even though I tend to think of myself as more of a futurist, it's always good to remember that people had smart ideas before us. And so when I think about how we can use the technology to take these sort of incremental steps with feedback, mastery is a buzzword that everyone talks about it, but I think go back to original Benjamin Bloom, when we talk about taxonomy work. He's the originator of mastery-based learning, but what he meant by it is sort of different. The secret sauce that he talked about was feedback and correctives, and it means something very specific. And there was a lot of research on that up until Nation at Risk and everything, where everyone said, "Oh, we've got to shift focus from every kid can be competent to whatever." But I actually think there's components there around the nature of the kind of feedback and what people do off of it to make it actionable, and the fact that, for example, feedback is not just then doing the exact same thing you didn't do very well again. It's actually using alternative representations and things. So I think there's ways that we can enrich feedback based on Bloom's original ideas, and I think that's a really great starting point. It's not going to be everything, but I think it's a good starting point. Thank you.
I just thought you might be interested in a study out at MIT. And they've taken all of the capabilities of the edX platform and they put it into an on-campus physics 1 course. What that's allowed us to do is to get clickstream data of how students use the technology at a very fine grain, And the number one feature that the students liked was a very rudimentary check and X system. So they had put the homework problems online, and the students can immediately see whether the answer to the individual pieces of the problem, right or wrong. The students reported at something like mid-90% that they love this. I don't know if any of you are educational. I know one of you is an educational researcher. Students don't like anything at that level. But what we've been able to do is to actually watch how they use that feedback, that rudimentary feedback, and to understand what's advantageous about it, and then how they go to other resources based on that feedback. And we've also watched them in real time working with each other with the system. So my own feeling about this is that we have to do much more research, and that the MOOC platforms allow us to get that kind of data that we could never see before, the kinds of behaviors and interactions.
I agree. And Lori always knows best. Right, whatever you think.
All right. Well, thank you. So we're going to wrap up. I want to thank all the panelists, starting with Geneva. And I would like to be the on how grateful I am, because they are actually technically on vacation week there, and they still have taken time to be with us.
They get vacation?
Yes, they do get vacation. And not that time here is any less valuable, because these gentlemen here have taken time from their busy daily schedule to come and be with us, and I really, really am very grateful to all of you. So thank you. And so thank you. À bientôt, Genève. I'll see you in April, hopefully. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye. And so all of you here, join us. There's a quick lunch thanks to Swissnex. Thank you very much.